Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Hochschild. I'm a faculty member in the Government Department and Department of African American Studies and Schedule C, whatever that means, in the Harvard Kennedy School. So I have an appointment in the Kennedy School as well. Welcome and delighted to see everybody. This is, of course, the Inequality and Social Policy Seminar for this week. The series is a wonderful series. It's made possible with our great gratitude by the James M. and Kathleen Stone PhD Scholars Program, which is housed in the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And today we are completely delighted to welcome Professor Jamila Michener of Cornell University. She's in the Department of Government. She'll be introduced by Elizabeth Tom, who's a PhD candidate in the Government and Social Policy program here at Harvard. Let me turn it over to Elizabeth Tom, who will introduce our speaker.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone. As Jennifer mentioned, I'm Elizabeth Tom. I'm a third year in Government and Social Policy, as well as a Malcolm Weiner Scholar in Poverty and Justice here at Harvard. I have the privilege of introducing and welcoming Dr. Jamila Michener to our Inequality Seminar today. Dr. Michener is an Associate Professor of Government at Cornell University, as well as co-director of the Cornell Center for Health Equity, co-director of the Politics of Race, Immigration, Class, and Ethnicity Initiative, and board chair of the Cornell Prison Education Program. Professor Michener studies American politics and policy with a particular focus on the political causes and consequences of poverty and racial inequality. Her work explores the conditions under which economically and racially disadvantaged groups engage in the political process, the effects of that engagement, and the role of the state in shaping the political and economic trajectories of marginalized communities. Her book, Fragmented Democracy, Medicaid, Federalism, and Unequal Politics, examines how Medicaid and federalism interact to influence interpretations of democratic citizenship among beneficiaries. Perhaps most importantly, in my view, the book assesses American political life from the vantage point of those living in or near poverty and are reliant on the federal government for vital resources. The book is one of my favorites that I read during graduate school. I have my thoroughly bookmarked copy here as proof. Professor Michener's research has been supported by the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, the National Science Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. She received her MA and PhD from the University of Chicago and her undergraduate degree from Princeton University. Prior to joining the faculty at Cornell, she was a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Scholar at the University of Michigan. One of my personal goals has been to see how many times I can ask Professor Michener to come talk to us at Harvard. I'm 2 for 2 so far in my graduate career. And so I'm just so thrilled and grateful for her taking the time to join us today. And so without further ado, I'll hand things over to her.
All right, thank you for that super kind introduction, Elizabeth. I really appreciate it. I am going to jump right in and share my screen. And I will say, as a kind of warning, that I think, probably folks who are sort of wiser and more strategic than me when they're invited to give talks at places like Harvard, where they know there'll be a ton of smart and sort of critically thinking people in the room, perhaps give like their most polished thing that they have on the shelf. And that is just not my approach. So my approach is to present you with work that is a true work in progress in the hopes of really getting feedback that's going to be valuable to the work. So this is part of a larger project that is ultimately going to be a book project. And that book and project is one that I'm working on with Mallory Sorrell, who's an assistant professor at Duke. And it taps into a set of issues that I've long been pretty preoccupied with and pretty concerned about. I think early in my time as a graduate student, and certainly as an assistant professor, I was hesitant. I felt like this was a project I wasn't sure how it fit into American political science. And I wanted to wait until I was at a bit of a later point, until I had a better sense of what I would do with the project before I really took it on. And right at the time where I was deciding to take it on, I figured out that Mallory, who was a Cornell PhD and was finishing up at Cornell, we figured out we both had an interest in the same topic. And so we've decided to take it on together. And I'm going to present to you today some of it's a pretty wide ranging and multifaceted project, so I can't present the whole book, and the book isn't finished yet, so I definitely can't. But I'll present to you some of our initial findings from our qualitative work, and look forward to hearing from folks about their feedback on that. So our focus is on the civil legal system and on civil legal inequality. So what do I mean by that? And really, for me, it starts here. This is a Queens Legal Services, a legal services firm in Queens, New York, where I grew up, actually. And they offer legal services to low-income people who have non-criminal legal problems, right? So civil legal problems. And I actually, back when I thought I wanted to be a lawyer as an undergraduate, many years ago, I actually interned right here at Queens Legal Services. I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, but at that point I was already pretty focused on racial inequality and poverty. And so I thought, if I'm going to be a lawyer, I have to be a lawyer that represents, people living in poverty and people of color. And I had grown up in Queens, New York, myself, in low-income communities and communities of color. And I wanted to do work that was relevant to those communities. So I thought, okay, I'm going to be a lawyer. And I was lucky enough to even get an internship at a low-income legal services firm in my own community, not far from where I grew up. It was an experience that obviously stayed with me, because now I'm working on a whole book about this topic, right? But it very much moved me. Many of the women and many of the clients who came into this office were women, and they were Black and brown, and Asian women, many of whom were being evicted, many of whom were facing dramatic and really difficult to maneuver debt, and a wide range of other non-criminal legal problems, right? And those include what I've already mentioned, housing and debt, but also people losing their health benefits, many women in domestic violence situations who were looking to get orders of protections or other forms of protection that fit into the civil and not criminal realm, family cases around child custody and support, and of course, immigration around detention and deportation. So the civil legal realm is actually a huge space, and we won't be able to cover all of this space. So today I'm really gonna focus on housing. My broader project with Mallory is kind of two-tiered, and we look at housing and debt. But the housing piece is the piece I've spent the most time on thus far, and where we have the most data, and so that's what I'm going to focus on today. But this experience, interning all those years ago, really shaped some initial questions that I had around the civil legal system. And what I remember asking at that time were many why questions. Why are there so many people coming in here being evicted? Why can't we help many of them, right? The majority of them, in fact, were being turned away because Queens Legal Services simply did not have the capacity to represent all of the people who needed help, even when they had meritorious cases and real need. Why are so many of the people coming into this office women? Why are so many of them people of color? And I had so many whys, and I remember asking one of the attorneys one day, probably 3 or 4 of these why questions, as we were working on some things. And he said, look, we don't do why here. We can't. We just do what? What can we do to help these folks in the immediate term so that they're not vulnerable, so that they're not unhoused, so that they're not suffering? And I respected tremendously that response from that particular attorney, but also immediately had a sense that that wasn't the work for me, that I really wanted to be asking the why questions and understanding the bigger both causes and consequences of the civil legal system as I was, observing it way back then when I was in college. So that has always remained in the back of my mind. And I was excited, after I finished my first book, and I felt like I was sort of solid in terms of the tenure track and tenure. I was excited to sort of turn my attention to this project, and super excited to be able to find a co-author who's quite incredible. And it makes sense, for me, it made sense that I was much better able to imagine what this project might look like or how it might fit into the discipline of political science when I started to think about this work more seriously 2 years ago, than I had been at the beginning of graduate school, say in 2004, right? There's been just this, this flourishing of really great work thinking about the criminal legal system, right? And thinking about how the carceral state has implications for political participation, democratic citizenship, and a range of other outcomes. And political scientists have done this work, sociologists have done it, and so on and so forth. And so there was at least a context for me to think about how legal systems matter, particularly in the context of American politics. And there's been more and more work, and I think work challenging us to take seriously what government looks like for people at the economic and racial margins, and how aspects of government that we can sometimes be, insufficiently sensitized to are actually really significantly shaping the sort of everyday lives of people on the margins. But as I showed on the previous slide, a lot of the emphasis there has been on the criminal side of the legal system. And this is an important boundary that legal scholars and others make between civil and criminal. And we've paid much less attention, in particular as political scientists, although I would say even beyond that, to the civil side of the system, right? And to the extent that criminal law is about punishing those who do wrong, right? Now, it's about a whole bunch more than that. And that even that formulation we should take critically and not for granted. But in theory, that's what criminal law is about, right? Civil law and the kind of corresponding element to that, again, and this is in theory, is about providing a remedy, right? It's about protecting people from harm and in some way or to some degree making them whole. And when I thought about that, when I initially started to read on sort of the boundary between criminal and civil, and I thought about the function, at least in ideal world, of the criminal legal system, I thought, well, ostensibly the criminal legal system could be and should be operating very differently than the civil legal system could be and should be operating very differently than the criminal legal system. Perhaps it can really provide remedy and really mean something quite different for people on the economic and racial margins. And part of the kind of large backdrop of this project is wanting to explore that and understand that. But of course, the civil legal system is marked by deep inequalities that are different from, but resonant with in many ways, the criminal legal system. So we can think about this in terms of class. Low-income households are disproportionately likely to experience at least one civil legal problem, right? And this is 2017 data. I would imagine that it actually looks quite different now, and these numbers are even higher because of the kinds of problems that people have faced during the pandemic. But this is 2017 data from the Legal Services Corporation, and they asked people, they kind of give them a list of potential civil legal problems and asked them which they had experienced in their households in the last year. And we see that, a significant number, 3 out of 4 low-income households are likely to experience at least one of these problems, right? And a non-trivial minority of low-income households are experiencing a lot of these problems, 6 or more civil legal problems, right, in the last year. So civil legal challenges or having to navigate the civil legal system is something that is particularly acute in the lives of people who are living in or near poverty. And often these folks are not receiving much assistance, right? So they're on their own in a legal system that is not user-friendly, that is not really made for folks who don't have professional expertise in terms of the law, right? So the vast majority of low-income Americans are just not receiving any assistance with these civil legal problems that they have. And of course, the civil legal system, I would say like any system in the US and even across the world, is both racialized and gendered. A disproportionately Black and Latinx populations are reliant on the civil legal system as a way of navigating the civil legal problems that emerge in their life. And some of this is, of course, connected to the class dynamics that I just pointed out. And this system is also gendered. So if we think about beneficiaries of civil legal assistance, as far as what the Legal Services Corporation identifies, about 72% of them are women, right? So the system is both race and gendered. And thinking about all of this, I approach this work with a core question, right? Which is, and it's a very basic question at this point, and that's intentional. And the question is, what is the nature of the relationships between civil legal institutions and democratic citizenship, right? And so that flags for you the main things that I'm interested in thinking about, and I'll think about with you today: civil legal institutions and democratic citizenship. Of course, I'll have to tell you what I mean by both of those things as we think together about them and how they are connected. And part of the kind of overarching, or maybe I should say underlying logic that sort of courses through this whole project, and that is part of the rationale for this question, comes from a line in an APS article from like 1981 that Joe Sauce told me about, literally off the top of his head. He's like, do you know this article in APSR from the 1980s? And I'm like, I was born in the 1980s, Joe. So no, I don't know that article. But it was by a legal scholar and practitioner. Her name is Frances Kahn-Ziemens. And there's this, and it's about the civil legal system. And there's this great quote in there that says, the potential for every individual to mobilize the law can play an important role in democratic governance. And the idea there is that civil law can be mobilized by individuals ostensibly. And because that there's the potential of that kind of mobilizing the law on your behalf for your purposes in your defense, it's connected to democratic governance. It has important implications for democratic governance. And part of what we're doing in this project is really digging into what these implications are and what kinds of relationships they suggest. Okay, but what do I mean when I say democratic citizenship? I really do mean this in quite a broad way, and in a sort of lens informed by T.H. Marshall. If we think about this kind of tripartite breakdown of democratic citizenship and a kind of political component of democratic citizenship, which is about voice and participation, participatory outcomes are the kinds of outcomes that political scientists are often thinking about, right? And they're the kinds of outcomes that I often think about, although in broad terms, right? So not exclusively with respect to voting, although that's something to pay attention to, but even beyond voting, thinking about the ways, the variety of ways that people engage directly in the political system and have their voice heard. And then there's a social aspect to this, right? We think about what we might consider, on what some folks might consider social rights, access to basic necessities, things like housing, education, and health, right? And part of what it means to be a member of a democratic polity, ostensibly, is that you have some level of access to those kinds of social rights. And then, of course, there's a civil component to this. I think of this as a sort of protection from, right? And so it means that you will be protected to some degree from various forms of predation or exploitation, and that level of protection from predation, exploitation, and other harmful aspects of economic and social systems, that in particular minorities or people who are vulnerable will be protected from those things, but more broadly everyone will, right? As a function of being a member of a democratic polity. And so this is how I think about democratic citizenship, but how this actually plays out, I'll show you. We'll talk through in some of the actual findings, right? What about civil legal institutions? What do I mean when I say that? There are really three components here that I'm talking about, and that is not to say that that's exhaustive. It's just to say it's what we focused on thus far in the project. So the first part, and of course, we're interested in this democratic citizenship piece, which is intentionally capacious, right? Which is how we've started off, and which is something that we think is quite important. So the first civil legal institution to speak of is courts, civil legal courts, housing courts, debt courts, other courts where civil legal issues are adjudicated. For the purposes of the talk today, really housing courts. And courts matter. They're the first point of interface for many people. The way you even know you have a civil legal problem often is that you receive some sort of legal document. And that legal document often originates in the courts, or it directs you to the courts. It tells you when you have to show up for a hearing. It tells you that your landlord is evicting you, or that some other kind of legal proceeding is now going to happen and that you're expected to be involved in it, right? So the courts are a primary kind of basis of interface that people have with the civil legal system. many times, often they are the only interface, right? It's the only way that people are interacting with the system. But if folks are lucky and they're able to get an attorney, often they're also interacting with legal aid organizations like Queens Legal Services that I interned at, that I showed you a bit about at the beginning, or other kinds of legal aid organizations that provide people with legal aid who are low income and who cannot afford to pay for it. And then this last piece is community organizations. And I have to say, when I started out this research, I was really thinking about courts and legal aid organizations, but I wasn't so much thinking about community organizations as a part of the kind of larger civil legal infrastructure. And the way I started to think about community organizations is that as I explored what was going on in courts and legal aid organizations, I realized that community organizations were part and parcel of these processes. They were showing up at courts to support people. They were referring people to legal aid organizations. They were working directly with legal aid organizations to put on workshops, to teach people their rights and do all sorts of other things. And I'll talk about that more in detail later. But I realized pretty early on, we realized pretty early on that community organizations, grassroots community organizations, were an important part of the larger civil legal infrastructure. They weren't providing direct legal aid, and they weren't adjudicating in the way that legal aid organizations are, and they weren't adjudicating legal decisions in the ways that courts were, but they were involved in every way they could be involved otherwise. And so this is what I think of as civil legal institutions, these three institutions taken together. And so what we're trying to understand is how these institutions shape democratic citizenship as defined on the previous slide, which of course was intentionally broad. So what data will I bring to bear to think about this? Today, I'm going to focus on qualitative data. At the end, I'm happy to mention or talk about the various forms of quantitative data that we've been collecting and we'll be able to analyze and are continuing to collect now. So this is a multi-method project, but I'm going to focus on the qualitative data today. So that data consists of, in the first instance, in-depth interviews with key actors. We've had 59 of those interviews so far. Who are the key actors? People with legal problems. And we're starting with, and we're wanting to include people with legal problems who've never sought out legal assistance, right? So a lot of these people are, for example, this project started pre-COVID, so people who I met in courtrooms, right? And they're in court, they're in housing court, they're being evicted, they're there alone, they're unrepresented, they never even sought out a lawyer, didn't think they could afford it, didn't know they could get one. And so that's one category of folks. But then people with legal problems who did seek out legal assistance, but weren't able to get it, right? So some of these folks I meet in courtrooms as well. And they will mention that, you know, I would have loved to have a lawyer here, but I wasn't able to get one. People who do get legal assistance, so civil legal aid beneficiaries, the attorneys who are providing that assistance, and then leaders and members of grassroots organizations that interact with people who have civil legal problems and with attorneys and courts, right? And so that's the kind of full range as far as the interviews of people that we're interviewing. There are other people that we could interview. Some folks have said, what about judges? And happy to talk about that if people have questions in the Q&A. I've ended up like informally talking to judges because I'm sitting in courtrooms doing observation and they ask me who I am and why I'm there. But they thus far haven't been a part of the way we've been thinking about the key actors here. Ethnographic observation in courtrooms at meetings, so community meetings, often sometimes that involve attorneys who are doing, telling people about their rights or engaging people in other ways, and workshops. And these are often sponsored by community organizations who are trying to connect with members of the community experiencing civil legal problems, listen to their issues and help them in whatever ways they have. And I've been doing these various forms of ethnographic observation for the last 2 years, although ironically, I've done more in the last 6 to 8 months than I had ever before, because a lot of these meetings moved to online spaces and became in some ways actually more accessible to me than they had been previously. A word about methods here before I dive into really talking about findings and what we're seeing so far. we take a qualitative approach, which I've already said and is quite clear, but it's worth pointing out some details about what the goal there is, right? The goal is truly description. So you'll notice the question that I presented at the beginning of the talk was, what are the relationships between civil legal institutions and democratic citizenship? What is the nature of those relationships? What is the context and the content of them? You know, in a space like this where frankly it's been underexplored, what questions about what relationships even look like are a really important and critical starting point, and not even a starting point like we're just going to ask the what question so that we can get to the next thing and do like causal stuff, right? But no, they are questions that themselves give us a lot of rich and important information, as well as providing us with a basis for asking other kinds of questions that are more amenable to quantitative and other approaches. But so we start with the what questions, and the goal is to better understand the phenomena of interest, right? So I've explained to you what I mean by civil legal institutions and what I mean by democratic citizenship, but one of the things that has happened as the research has progressed is that the nature of those phenomena have become much more clear to me, and the various aspects of them that matter, right? That's been kind of highlighted by this rich qualitative work. And you'll notice when I said I'm interested in what kinds of relationships there are between those things, I didn't have an arrow going from, you know, civil legal institutions to democratic citizenship. It's not to say that at some point we won't be interested in, and we are. This is why we're also collecting quantitative data in identifying the kind of causal relationships between these things, or thinking, you know, about other things like frequency. You know, I might see a certain kind of relationship that emerges in the qualitative data, but I don't necessarily know how frequent that is, how likely it is, how often it's happening. I don't know necessarily about the distribution of that. Like, is it happening everywhere? Is it only happening in small rural towns or big cities or what have you? So there's a lot that I don't know about frequency and distribution just from the qualitative data, but there's a whole ton that the qualitative data tells me, answering those what questions and sensitizing me to the nature of the phenomena of interest that I would simply not get if all I looked at was quantitative data. And in fact, like, as we've structured, we have some surveys that we've put questions on now, but even thinking about the survey questions, the nature of them, what to ask, how to ask it, wouldn't really have been possible without this qualitative work informing the project. And it's worth saying that, you know, qualitative research and the qualitative findings I'll present provide a certain amount of depth, right? And so they may be limited in terms of breadth, but are very rich in terms of depth. And the benefit there is that, you know, when I think about qualitative work, one of the most exciting and beneficial pieces of it are that it helps us get to what you see at the bottom of the pyramid here, right? The stuff you don't know. So we have the stuff we know, which is actually very little. You know, it's a healthy dose of humility there as a social scientist. There's a lot we don't know. There are some things we know, and that's pretty little. And then there are things that we don't know, but we know we don't know them, right? And so we're trying to explore them. We're looking for ways to find out about them. We're looking for kind of methodological and empirical inroads to advance and deepen our knowledge in those areas. But then there's this whole swath of things we don't even know we don't know it. And we can't know without really talking to people, without really immersing ourselves in these institutions and these processes. And then suddenly there are outcomes of interest that we didn't know were outcomes of interest. There are independent variables that we didn't know would be independent variables, right? And that's what I'm sort of drawing out in this part of the project by taking this approach. As far as case selection, which I won't spend too much time on, but I will just say, we're focusing on housing today. I'm focusing on housing, and I mentioned that already. There are lots of reasons to focus on housing. It's one of the most common civil legal problems. Contract cases, which are essentially, most of which are landlord-tenant cases, make up a really significant portion of all civil legal cases. And a lot of those involve housing in some form or the other. The data that we have prior to this last pandemic year suggests that, you know, and we know this from Matthew Desmond's work, that evictions are a real problem. They're only one kind of housing problem. They're the kind that is the most staggering and they're the kind that is the most salient. But people are dealing with substandard housing conditions. They're dealing with insufficient accommodations from landlords for disability and other issues. The range of housing problems is really wide, and these all fall into the civil legal space. And so evictions are really just the tip of the iceberg. And of course, even that tip has grown larger and more significant in the wake of the pandemic. Even more reason to be paying attention to housing in this sphere. We were already focusing on housing before the pandemic, and we were already thinking about it as a really critical civil legal domain. And the last year has only made it more clear why that's more important, especially given the lens that we're taking to this project, which is really focusing on folks who are economically and racially marginalized. And if we think about who is, most at risk when it comes to the housing space, even if we look at this through the lens of eviction, it really is folks of color, renters, especially those with children. And so we wanna zero in on this space where there's both a lot going on nationally, and it's just substantively like really important to understand more about. And it's gonna allow us to think about what's going on in the communities that we're interested in focusing on in the work. Okay, I'm gonna jump to some findings here, and I'll talk you through them. I always like to say, really what we're finding is that there are complex and multifaceted relationships between civil legal institutions and democratic citizenship. Of course, right? It's so obvious as to not be a finding. But it's really important to start there, which is to say, I thought at the beginning of this project that I might find something more akin to the kinds of things that we see in this literature that I'm a part of in my previous work around and ongoing work around health policy and Medicaid, which is the policy feedback literature. And often in the policy feedback literature, we identify a policy and we try to understand its relationship to political outcomes. And we might find a relationship that has some level of complexity, but that can be described at least on a kind of overarching level. That, the relationship between receiving cash assistance benefits and political participation is a negative one, and the relationship between receiving, Social Security or Medicare and political participation is a positive one. And we have those kinds of like top line, like this is what the relationship looks like, statements that we can make. And I went into this thinking like maybe there'll be something like that emerges from this, right? And if there were something I would have suspected, it would have been that the civil legal system would be largely just demobilizing and would really have, in many ways, a kind of negative, there'd be a negative relationship between kind of what I think of as positive forms of democratic citizenship, political voice, access to resources and benefits vis-a-vis social rights, and even protection from predation with respect to civil rights. I would have thought, on all of these metrics, maybe we'll see these civil legal institutions aren't really functioning to protect and support and mobilize and empower people at the economic and racial margins. If I had a suspicion going in, it was that, and it came from really my own observations in the time I spent in the internship, and my own kind of sense of the American, economic and political order and how it tends to position people at the economic and racial margins. And what I found is that suspicion going in, it's not so much that it's not that there's not something to it, but that it's a lot more complicated than that, right? Civil legal institutions, as I've defined them, can certainly do inform perceptions of political actors, right? So they're shaping at least, political outcomes along this line, right? How people think about a variety of political actors. And I'll talk about what I mean by that and give some examples. I hadn't thought much about this, but found lots of evidence for it in the data so far, that these institutions can play a role in enabling various forms of economic exploitation. So that's the civil component, which are you protected from predation and exploitation through the quote unquote rights that a system like the civil legal systems are ostensibly meant to convey. And they can, and this is the part that I've probably been most surprised about in my findings. I can't say anything about frequency, right? But I certainly can say that civil legal institutions can, in fact, motivate political engagement and prompt it, both on the part of individuals and they provide a basis to organizations and provide them with a pathway towards and a motivation for organizing communities, especially marginalized communities in particular ways. So there's this overarching, this is complicated, and then there are some more specifics, like here are some of the ways that these institutions can actually operate. And I want to sort of talk you through examples of what I mean here. And I'll point out that the examples are examples, but they're also reflective of what's coming up again and again and again in the qualitative findings. Okay, so one thing that I'll say even before we get there on a more overarching point, before I get to specific data, is that one of the things that I found is that the institutional node really matters. So whether I'm talking about courts, legal aid, or community organization really matters for this larger question of how is this institution connected to democratic citizenship? And of course, all of these institutions are embedded within particular policy contexts that vary across states and across localities. And I won't talk very much about that now, but I will say that there's a significant part of the project that pays attention to these varying policy complex and contexts and thinks about the role of, for example, federalism in structuring everything that's going on, everything that I'm talking about today. I just won't discuss that too much today because I really want to hold myself to 40 minutes so that we have enough time for Q&A and less than that if possible. But I will say, within this circle, we can imagine that we hold a given policy context constant, that these institutional nodes are playing very different roles in people's lives and in ways that create an almost inverse relationship between the power of the institution and the positive kind of political role or role in terms of democratic citizenship that the institution can play in people's lives. So courts that are in fact most powerful in this infrastructure, right, are and most powerful because the decisions that get made there are affecting people's lives in profound ways. And once they're made there, there's very little people can do about them, right? And they're experienced largely as alienating, confusing, and demoralizing places. So they're powerful with respect to their ability to affect people's lives, but often affecting people's lives in terms of how they experience those institutions in really quite negative and disempowering ways. Legal aid is sort of this middle node where it's actually affecting people's lives in positive ways. When I talk to people who are, and I'll show you examples of this in just a second, who receive legal assistance, they sing the praises of legal aid as a system and talk about how it's really saved them in many ways. And sometimes this prompts people to engage, right? To engage democratically in ways they wouldn't have before, and to even to change their life choices that they make in ways they wouldn't have before. So there's some indirect mobilizing. It's not because legal aid attorneys are saying, go engage politically, not at all. So that's what I mean by indirect. There's some indirect mobilizing that goes on there, but legal aid organizations are quite limited. They have to turn away regularly over half of the people seeking help. And even the people that they can often only help in very limited ways, and they recognize their own limitations. Attorneys tell this to me all the time. And then of course, community organizations that of all these institutional nodes really have, in many ways, the least power in the sense that they're most resource deprived and have the least extensive reach. They're usually serving, narrow and specific communities. They are actually doing the most work in terms of building power in people who have civil legal problems in their lives and empowering them. And so it's this interesting kind of inverse relationship between the power of the institution and the role it plays in building power in the lives of people with civil legal problems. So what are some examples here? This is, and by the way, I don't expect you to be able to read all of this text. I certainly won't read it all for you all, or else we'll be here all day. I do highlight in red pieces that are really important, and then I'll just narrate the rest to you. So this is Ronald, an African-American man in New York City who tells me about his experiences with the courts. And he had been in the hospital for 2 months because his lungs collapsed. And he gets out of the hospital and he's almost immediately served by his landlord's lawyer. He's really surprised because he had managed to keep paying his rent, even in the hospital with collapsed lungs. And so didn't get why he would be evicted when he had been paying his rent. He's a single father with 5 kids. He's totally astonished when he gets evicted. And he says, I couldn't understand one word on the document, one paragraph, one sentence of what I was reading. His landlord's lawyer hands him documents he knows nothing, has no understanding of the documents or the system. And, Ronald is a high school dropout, and he's, brilliant in his ability to relay his experiences and understand his larger context to me, but has no reason to or experience with navigating even the documents he's receiving from the court. Candida similarly is getting taken to court by her landlord, who is claiming that she's not paying rent. She's like, but I have been paying rent and I have all the receipts and I have all the records. It's fine. I don't need an attorney. It must just be a simple error. I'm going to go to court. I'm going to state my truth and everything's going to be fine. Of course, in short order, Candida figures out that she was naive and that it's not just about going there with her rent statements and stating her truth. She ends up in a 4-year battle with her landlord, who it turns out is just trying to get her out because she has a rent controlled apartment and he wants to renovate it and be able to rent it at a market rate. And so this begins a sort of long battle for her, but she talks about how she didn't realize at that point what the resources were in court. She doesn't know who anybody is. She doesn't know who's representing who, just doesn't know what's going on, right? And when I look for this phrase, I don't know, it comes up again and again and again in the interviews whenever people are talking about the courts. The main thing they say is, I just had no idea what was going on. And when attorneys talk about courts, they don't actually sound much different. This is Marissa. All these names are made up, by the way. They're not people's actual names. In New York, and she's an attorney. And she says, look, what you see if you walk into housing court, what is it? It's mayhem. And she says, it's not adequate. It hasn't functioned as a proper court of law. And that's not just busy, crowded New York City, right? Jay, an attorney in Florida, says, look, in Florida, tenants are not even allowed to go to court and face their landlords in court unless they deposit every single thing that the landlord claims they're owning into an account for the court to hold. So tenants don't even get their day in court. There's no such thing as your day in court unless you can pay for it. And attorney after an attorney after attorney, whether it's in Georgia or in New York or in Florida, and I've been talking to people all over the country, the contexts are different, right? This rent deposit law in Florida, there's nothing like that in New York. It would never happen in a relatively tenant-friendly state like New York. So the policy contexts differ, and that matters. But the story about the courts is actually astonishingly similar across place. And of course, this informs people's political perceptions, right? They think of-
Jamila, I'm going to interrupt you. This is absolutely fascinating, and we want you to keep going, but it's also after 1, and we're going to leave some room for questions. So
yeah, I'm right about to wrap up.
Okay, because we need to wrap up collectively at 1:15.
Okay.
Although people may continue. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. The time goes quick. I will circulate these slides so everyone can see this. And so this informs people's political perceptions and in ways that are racialized, right? And in various ways enables exploitation. People are so desperate to avoid the courts that they make side deals with their landlords that are really terrible for them, right? And legal aid organizations provide people with a way out of this exploitative, alienating environment. And that often or sometimes, at least in the cases I've come across, motivates people to engage. Once legal aid helps them, they sort of want to figure out how they can be a part of the process and be a kind of change, positive change. Community organizations go even further than legal aid organizations. They actually organize on the basis of the injustices that are happening in civil courts. And they use that as a way of drawing people into their organizations and building power, right? And whether it's in New York, in Kentucky, or where have you, organizations talk about how they explicitly use injustice in civil courts as an organizing strategy. They go to the courts, they engage people there, And they use that as a kind of locus of organizing folks who they otherwise might not be able to pull in. They do all sorts of actions and pull in people from across their communities, meaning that civil legal problems actually become a locus for organizing and mobilizing, and community organizations use civil legal problems for their benefit as far as organizing communities. So that's where I was going to wrap up. Of course, it's complicated, but we're learning about how it's complicated, the various outcomes at play, and some of the institutional structure of the complexity. And in other parts of the project, working on larger systemic connections at work. So I'll stop there. Happy to talk about my research trajectory in the Q&A, but I want to make sure to leave space. That was the fastest 40 minutes ever.
Thank you. That is absolutely terrific. We've got some time because Jamila was very efficient for questions. Liz, go ahead. You get the first question. Liz Tom.
Great, thank you so much. This is fascinating. I think I'm still sort of, it's not something I know a lot about, and I think I'm digesting a lot of it. I'm curious to what extent you think so far, based on your research, that this inverse power relationship is different in the civil context versus the criminal context. Is that unique to the civil setting, or something that might be a parallel?
Well, that's interesting. I think that it is, in some ways, there's a parallel, but if there's a difference, it's really with the community organizations. Community organizations, some of them do both criminal and civil work, and will talk to me about both. And the criminal side is not nearly as much of a basis for organizing and mobilizing, because there's a perception there that perhaps somebody has done something wrong, right? But on the civil side, like, everybody deserves a place to live. Everybody deserves their day in court. Everybody deserves a fair day in court where they have as much of a chance as the landlord side does. There's a much deeper sense of kind of injustice and wrongdoing on the civil side. And community organizations use that as a basis for mobilizing people and say, now come and join us, right? The other thing is that there's much more space on the civil side for making the case that these are not individual problems. When an individual is in criminal court, you think they've done something, they've broken the law. Even if they haven't done something, it's their individual problem that they have to work out with the law. And we might think that the law is unjust or that it's unfair, but it's still quite an individual problem. The way that many people come to think about, especially once they've engaged community organizations, about civil problems, is that they're not at all individual. It's not about you and your landlord. It's about the fact that housing is unaffordable and the city or the state isn't helping to make it affordable. And none of this is fair, especially in the context of COVID. It's definitely not about you not being able to pay your rent. We're in a pandemic. Why should you be expected to pay your rent, right? So there's the kind of pathway to convincing people that it is a political problem and not an individual problem is much richer on the civil side, which creates a quite different kind of politics.
Really interesting, thank you.
Let's take two questions, one from Amy Hayes and one from Paige Kelly. And if I have time, I'm going to sneak a question into my own, but we probably have more from the audience. So Amy and then Paige.
Thank you so much for being here. I worked at a legal aid service up in Maine last summer, and the courts were closed, so all we did was eviction work. But I wanted to ask, there seems to be, I'm really curious in this community organization, legal aid, where do you see social services such as social workers fitting into that model? And how do you see the work that, often I feel like a legal aid worker is talking to or maybe not aware of, or is aware of a caseworker being involved, and sort of how do you see social services in this environment?
Paige, go ahead and ask your question.
So I'm a rural sociologist, and so just as a little context for my question, but I'm kind of curious about, there's a literature on kind of like legal deserts in rural areas. And I saw that you had like Kentucky, which might be, I don't know where your interviews are taking place within Kentucky, but, I think there could be some interesting political implications if there's just an absolute dearth of like legal resources, and therefore, and same with like community organizations, like there might be less opportunities for that type of mobilization, and then what the implications would be so far as like if you can't even gain access to maybe those more mobilizing institutions of the legal institution, like how that would play out in terms of like spatial inequities as well, besides just the class and racial and gender inequities.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to try to move quickly, but those are really great questions. So on the first question around social services, this is something that I've been learning. Again, this is why I love the qualitative data, because I hadn't really thought about this until I started to interview people. And one of the things that a lot of the community, like membership-based grassroots community groups tell me about, like social services groups that provide people with like rental assistance and just various forms of help, is that those groups are great, but can often get in the way because people will come to them, whether it's a tenant union or some other kind of organization that's focused on power building. Tenants will come to them and say, help me, right? And expect a social services model. But a lot of the power building community grassroots groups say, we have to unteach people the social services model. We want them to get the social services, we'll refer them to them, we'll tell them about rental assistance, like we want them to have their material needs met. But then once they get those needs met, we don't want them to stop. We want them to realize they have to keep building power beyond their individual problems. So social services are about providing people with their material needs on an individual level. The grassroots community organizations are trying to build power on a collective level. And those things can work together, but often are also coming into tension. And that's something that the community groups are always trying to figure out and navigate. So that's a great question. Paige, you're entirely right that there's great variation in terms of the kind of access to, especially the community organizations, but also the legal services. I have made a point of interviewing people in both rural, suburban, and urban places. I'm in upstate New York myself. I actually live in a pretty rural part of the country. And so it's completely different. And a big way that it's different is there's much less access to both to attorneys and to community groups. I think one thing so that means there's some spatial inequality that also maps on often to class inequality and in interesting ways, but not always obvious racial inequality. So those things are interconnected. And I guess the last thing I would say there is that one of the things that I've been finding is that so I've been talking to like tenant unions and associations and organizations in really rural areas. And one of the things that's interesting is that when they emerge, like it's a whole new landscape in that area. And there's a whole lot of socialization work. Like they're like, people around here don't know what to do with an organization like us. They don't know what we're talking about when we start talking about power. And so we have to do all of this work in terms of just socializing these concepts, right? But once that starts to take off, it's pretty incredible. Like some of these organizations find that the demand and the appetite in rural areas for this kind of community engaged work is incredible, right? So there's both like problems there and there's possibilities.
Okay, we have 3 minutes and at least 2 more questions. I think Jenny Mandrovich has a question in the chat that I'm going to leave there so that she and you can discuss it. So Tabitha and Hunter, you each get about a half a minute to ask your question. And then Jamila, you have about 2 minutes to answer both of them. And then we will very regretfully have to end. So really quick, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. This means a lot to me. I am a nearly licensed civil law attorney, and I'm also from Queens. So I totally feel all of this. My first question is, what about the role that state attorney general offices play? I work at one, and we sort of straddle very clearly politics as well as legal services. My second question is, I look at these problems and I see a large issue starting with the pipeline. People don't know when to use a lawyer, right? That's something rich people usually do, but low income people don't know when to get a lawyer. And so do you have any solutions about how we can address that pipeline issue from the very beginning? Thank you.
Great questions.
Hang on 1 second. Hunter.
Okay, awesome. Hi, it's nice to see you again, Jamila. I had a question related to the funding of these community organizations. So you mentioned that they're extremely resource constrained, but as another person that has worked for one of these organizations as an undergrad, I understand that they rely heavily on government grants to sort of get off the ground. So does that at all play into how they sort of pitch themselves to potential beneficiaries? Is sort of like that reliance on the government, like at all leading into this policy feedbacky type of effect that you're trying to identify?
Oh yeah, these are wonderful questions. So quick answers. Tabitha, I'm not sure about the state attorneys generals because I haven't thought about that much. So I would love to follow up and hear your thoughts. One thing I will say is that some of the grassroots organizations are very skeptical of dealing with formal political actors like that, and feel as though those are the sort of actors that water down their demands and really like take a lot, kind of slow them down, right? As far as, wait, so your first question, no, that was your first question. Your second was about, oh, now it's totally escaping me. Oh, pipeline. Yeah, and the one thing I'd say quickly about that is just that community groups themselves are a huge part of dealing with that pipeline problem. Like they're often the ones that tell people you should see a lawyer, and they don't stop there. They're like, you should see a lawyer and also come to our organizing meeting and we can teach you how to fight this like outside of the courts, because they're not going to be our space for liberation. But they're also doing a lot of the work of structuring the pipeline and trying to widen it out. Really quickly, Hunter, that is an excellent, excellent question. And one of the things that I didn't start off sensitized to, but I became quite sensitized to talking to like groups on the ground, is that there's actually a pretty significant distinction between groups that are autonomous, right? Like a lot of tenant unions and associations and organizations go out of the way to say, we are autonomous. We don't get government funding. We don't get foundation funding. We don't get any of it. We have our membership dues or we just donate, right? And they go out of their way to say it because they think it's significant, that it signals something about what's possible. We can shut down courts. We can do eviction blockades where we stop the cops from evicting someone. We can do things that like probably we would lose our government funding for, or foundation funders would be really uncomfortable with, because nobody owns us. We're completely autonomous. And the folks who are more reliant on funding, I will say, government grants and such, I have completely different kinds of conversations with those organizations than I do with the autonomous ones. So, you know, my suspicion is that division is an important one. It's a really significant one.
Unfortunately, we're over time. I didn't get to ask my question, but there were a couple of other questions in the chat. Let me invite, if it's okay with you, Jamila, the students to be able to stay for a few more minutes and talk with you. Maybe you could sneak Jenny Mansbridge in too, even though she's a lifelong student, so she gets to count. But otherwise, for the rest of us, this is terrific. It's great work. I remember talking with you several years ago at dinner, and you were just starting it, and it's just great to see how it's shaping and cohering and coming together. And there's obviously lots more you could tell us, but we'll have to wait for the next time Liz invites you. So, thank you very much, everyone.
Jane, I'm happy to jump in on your question. I think it's a good one. And actually, as I was answering the question, I was sort of thinking about this, right? And in some senses, I think it's a difference of scale and emphasis, right? So often when we think about, for example, like Movement for Black Lives, right? They're often responding to like hyper salient instances of injustice by police or other criminal legal, officials. And so there is like a shared sense of injustice and a response to that. So it's not to say that there's no ability to mobilize on the basis of what's happening on the criminal legal side of things. There absolutely is, right? But I think that ability to mobilize is even more ripe in many senses on the civil legal side of things, because there are many organizations that take the stance that like every single eviction is morally wrong. Every single person living in substandard housing is a moral and political failure. We can mobilize everyone. We don't have to find the egregious cases of like police violence. We don't have to think about this person's guilt or innocence. The whole system like is corrupt. and is based on an exploitative political economy that needs to be undermined. And so every single person in housing court is someone we can mobilize, right? And I think on the criminal side, like there's not that same like scale in terms of the people or the instances in which like mobilization is like ripe for the picking. That's my sense of it, but I have to think more on this.
Just one quick, I buy your sense of which is better material for mobilizing because you're there and I'm not. But on the scale thing, quite a few people on Black Lives Matter and other similar movements are focused on things like stop and frisk as well. Things that are very much everyday, that aren't just these one-time, one-shot extraordinary cases, but actually have to do with everyday lives. So although people aren't mobilizing around them, mobilizing as quite that way that you're talking about, and I completely, as I say, you're there, I'm not. So when you think about your gut on what's a mobilizable issue, I trust. But there are these, I just want to kind of say that within the larger criminal arena, there are these very everyday matters as well that I think that there's a lot of activity pointing at how unjust they are.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And this is great. It's given me a lot to think about. One thing that immediately strikes me is like, this is where I think race plays a huge role, because on the criminal side, the everyday matters in many ways are like really hyper concentrated in Black and brown communities, right? So that the vast majority of like white Americans get to live their lives with very little interaction with the police and not really having to think about this. On the civil side, of course, these racial dynamics still exist, but the experience of like having a landlord that's trying to manipulate you, or, being threatened with eviction, or having to move because is much more like shared, right? Across the spectrum. And so there's a different kind of capacity there, I think, for that reason as well, because you can literally go into that court and talk to anyone who's in there for a court proceeding. You can go into neighborhoods where you see high levels of eviction or lots of activity with respect to, gentrification, and just straight mobilize people, right? And you can do that in all different kinds of neighborhoods all over the country. And I think that on the criminal side, all of those elements exist, but in various ways are a little bit more targeted and limited. But I still have to think about that relationship, because I've never quite thought about it in the way you're pushing me to here, and I think it's super helpful.